All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's awesome to be here. I'm pretty honored and amazed that I have this opportunity to address all of you cover crop experts. I know there's a lot of people on the line. This is an amazing brain trust that's been assembled that comes together to support the work and drive the work of the Northeast Cover Crops Council. So it's cool to be here. I wish we were all in person and we could go get a beer after this is over, but the pandemic had other ideas this year. Hopefully there'll be better days next year. So just to introduce myself, again, my name is Mitch Hunter. I'm the research director at American Farmland Trust. And in case you're not familiar with AFT, we are a leading national conservation organization. We focus on protecting land from development, promoting sound farming practices, and maintaining vibrant communities of farmers and ranchers. And given the topic of my talk, I want to mention that we are nonpartisan. We work with both and all political parties around the country. And I mention that because I am going to be talking about party politics. You cannot talk about Congress without talking about parties. And I just want to make it clear from the get-go that I'll be sharing a number of observations, but I certainly will not be promoting one party or another. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be tackling today, my goal is to give you a sense of the current state of play on cover crop policy. And Brandon just gave us some super timely updates, kind of literally up to the minute. So I'll try to build on that. And I'll just start by saying cover crops are having a moment in the sun. This is a big time. There's a lot of focus and a lot of opportunity. But can it last? And what will it take to keep up the policy support for cover crops over the long haul? I think more importantly, and that first question is a subset of this bigger question, what is it going to take to make cover crops a fundamental part of our agricultural systems, especially in the Northeast? That's what I'll be trying to tackle today. No small task. To give you a sense of what has brought me here, I'll just quickly highlight my background. I got fascinated by the interplay between agriculture and the environment while working on a high desert cattle ranch in Eastern California, totally different environment than the Northeast US, when I was at Deep Springs College. And that kind of has become my mission for my life, to understand and help to reconcile that tension between agriculture and the environment. And that initially drove me to study government, of all things, to try to make a difference through policy. So after college, I went on to DC, and that was the first time that I worked for American Farmland Trust doing federal policy, working on the 2012 Farm Bill, which became the 2013 Farm Bill, which became the 2014 Farm Bill, as tends to happen in DC. I went from there, after some time doing that, back to school. I went to Penn State, as Heather mentioned, for my PhD, focusing on cover crops, climate resilience. Here in this picture, you can see the little shelters that we use to create mini droughts in the field. And after that experience, I came back home to Minnesota, where I'm from, and did a postdoc at the University of Minnesota studying Kernza. So an even more envelope pushing conservation practice than cover crops typically are. And from there, that has led me back to American Farmland Trust as the research director, where my main focus is leading kind of nationwide analyses of agricultural land use change. But I also get to take part and help head up our work on climate and agriculture, which keeps me in the cover crop space as well. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm going to start this talk, the meat of it, the same way that every cover crop talk starts, by asking, what is a cover crop? But before you tune out and go do something else, I mean this question differently than you usually hear in a cover crop talk, because I'm thinking about what is a cover crop to a policymaker. Is it what we've traditionally thought of cover crops for? Is it an erosion control tool, a green manure, a soil health tool? Is it a forage? Well, more and more cover crops are being used as forage, which I think is a great thing. But that could have some policy implications related to harvest and financial support. What if the cover crop is a cash crop? And that line is being blurred more and more, all to the good, but again, raises some questions about how policy ought to treat those crops. Okay, what if a cover crop is a climate solution? Now we're in a different sphere. And really, as you'll see as I go through this talk, that's where things get interesting in DC around cover crop policy. Kind of related to that, what if a cover crop is a shovel-ready green infrastructure project? If you remember, after the Great Recession and when Obama came in office, there's this large bill. They were looking for shovel-ready infrastructure projects that you could get dollars out the door and you could get projects on the ground quick. Maybe we're treating cover crops that way now to a certain extent. And perhaps the biggest one is a cover crop, a silver bullet. And of course it's not, but I think it's important to think about these different ways of seeing cover crops if you put on your policymaker hat, because this shapes how policy treats them and what decisions are made. And in the last few years, policymakers have really taken notice of cover crops. In fact, I would say that cover crops have made it. There's lots of strong support. It's no longer a fringe idea. In fact, cover crops have the trifecta of political momentum. Decision makers at many levels of government want to do something to make cover crops happen in a bigger way. Also, policy innovation. New ideas are coming forward to overcome barriers, to hasten adoption, and they're actually being put into practice. And finally, there is a lot of private sector interest. Companies, old and new, are interested in helping farmers plant cover crops for a whole slew of reasons. The good news is that much of this support is bipartisan, but not all of it, especially as cover crops become more and more part of the Democrats' climate agenda. So keep that in mind. But for the moment, we're on the way up. Cover crops are looking good. In fact, cover crops are kind of taking over EQIP to a certain extent. If you look at the number of acres after 10 years of slow but steady growth, there's been an explosion over the last 5 years. And if you look at this chart, it can imply that this is coming at the expense of other very good conservation practices. But I think this is a positive thing. I think it shows responsiveness within NRCS and a responsiveness to the huge amount of interest and demand from the farmers themselves. And this is just set to keep going. So in addition to the cover crop initiative that Brandon mentioned, related to improving decision support tools, USDA also announced an EQIP cover crop initiative, I believe earlier this year. It's for 2022. It's a one-year effort at this point. And what they've done is to scrape together $38 million using some funds that were with state NRCS offices, some funds that were back at headquarters, to focus on boosting cover crop adoption in 11 states. And I'll note that Pennsylvania is the only Northeast Cover Crop Council state that is in this region, that's included in this initiative. So if you want to see more of this in your state, talk to your state conservationist and see if you can get in on the next round, if there is going to be a next round. Interestingly, in this announcement of this initiative, cover crops are billed as a natural and inexpensive climate solution. I agree, but that's a notable framing coming out of USDA. I would say that this initiative, while it's at this point just a one-off, it does reflect some great policy innovation. I'm certainly supportive of it. It aligns with a recommendation that AFT made to the Biden administration transition team as they were coming into office. And the cool thing is that it's not just funding, it's not just more dollars to farmers, but it will also streamline applications. And this helps address the criticism that EQIP can at times require a lot of paperwork for a relatively simple practice like cover cropping. And hopefully these tweaks help get more and more of these practices out the door and on the ground. So in a virtual room like this one full of cover crop fans, this policy probably sounds pretty great. But I want to ask your honest thoughts and kind of pose this question. So please just write down whatever you're thinking in the chat. I'll be interested to read it later, and everybody else in the room will benefit right now. So is this the right approach? Are cover crops, and I guess the positive case is that cover crops are a great gateway drug for conservation. They're simple enough. You can try them out. They've got a lot of buzz right now. And there's a lot of interest. So this could just be seen as totally efficient, responsive government. I think there's a good argument for that. But to stir the pot, I'll ask, is this too much of a silver bullet approach? Would a more holistic approach be more effective? For instance, there could be an initiative targeting soil health systems as opposed to just cover crops as a practice. Ponder that, put your thoughts in the chat. And again, I'm excited to read that afterwards. So regardless well, hopefully building on those thoughts, actually not regardless, we at AFT will be working to build on this initiative in the coming Farm Bill. Speaking of the Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, the last one that passed, helped pave the way for a lot of this current cover crop push. It has language to promote soil health broadly. It increases cover crop payment rates in the Conservation Stewardship Program, kind of the sister program to EQIP, known as CSP for short. And it made cover crops a good farming practice under crop insurance rules. So this removes barriers to using cover crops for farmers who rely on crop insurance, which is kind of a long-standing thorn in everyone's side. It helps harmonize the approach to cover crop across USDA, and it led to NRCS updating the termination guidance. So now in the eastern half of the United States, farmers can terminate their cover crops anytime before crops emerge from the soil, which opens the door for innovations like planting green. And if you're a farmer, you can request a waiver if you want to do something totally new and different, and you can find some backing for it among agricultural experts. You might be able to do that as well. I think that this whole approach has just paved the way for more flexibility, which led, as of last year, when you've got cover crops growing in a prevented planting situation, producers can now hay, graze, chop those cover crops at any point in time, just increasing the benefits that producers are going to get from planting cover crops. And overall, I would say that this is really great progress. The states are also experimenting with integrating crop insurance with cover crops. Specifically, 3 states in the Midwest are offering a $5 discount on their crop insurance to farmers on their crop insurance for planting cover crops. And this started in Iowa. AFT helped move it into Illinois. Indiana is picking it up. And it's also led to a national program, the Pandemic Cover Crop Program, which was launched June of last year and was recently renewed for 2022. In fact, the sign-up is almost closing. So if you have farmers you're working with who do use crop insurance and plant cover crops, let them know that they can enroll by March 15th to access the $5 an acre incentive that comes with this program. Interestingly, the rationale was to help producers maintain their cover crop systems despite the economic challenges of the pandemic. And not at all to minimize those challenges, but I think this is a little bit of a stretch to argue that this was the critical response needed in the pandemic, but it was a good stretch in my opinion. This was a great opportunity to advance an innovative policy linking cover crops to crop insurance that I strongly support. And I know that my policy colleagues at AFT will also be working to extend this program through the next Farm Bill. The states are also advancing cover crops through these much more comprehensive soil health bills. As of 2018, 22 states had programs that helped farmers plant cover crops. And just last year, 31 states considered soil health bills. That's a huge percentage of the country that was looking at soil health in their state legislature. And 14 of those states actually passed a bill, so lots of progress. Every state in the Northeast region has some activity except West Virginia. And as I'm sure you all know, Maryland has one of the most effective programs, and it has been that way for a while. But I ran the numbers and I was pretty astounded at what they've achieved. In 2017, the Maryland program enrolled more acres than Iowa, Virginia, and Missouri all combined, those 3 states' programs. Despite the fact that in Maryland, there are only 3% of the total cropland of those other 3 states combined. So this is incredibly outsized impact that the state of Maryland is having. You might ask how they're doing it. I certainly don't know all the ins and outs, but I'll note that they pay the most out of all of these state programs, up to $75 an acre for advanced practices. And they spend the most. In 2017, it was $22 million. So there's a component here of if you want the outcome, states have to pony up the dough. I think these state programs are great. I think they have the potential to strongly complement NRCS programs. They might get to be a little more flexible. They might be more responsive to local needs. And Representative Shelley Pingree from Maine put together a big omnibus bill called the Ag Resilience Act to touch on a lot of different ways that ag policy could promote climate smart practices like cover crops. One of them is to send money back to the states, to encourage states to create these state level programs. We're very supportive of this bill as a whole and that particular provision, and we're hoping that some of those provisions can advance in the 2023 Farm Bill that is coming up. Finally, carbon markets. I can't by any means try to cover these comprehensively, but they are another new driver in cover crop adoption. And it seems at this point that every ag input supplier has one. It's incredible to have that much private sector interest, but I will say it still feels a little bit like the Wild West. We're all trying to figure out what this is going to end up being, but it could be a big opportunity to get a lot more conservation on the ground. Interestingly, it could be a challenge for New England at the same time. So out of the 10 market systems that some of my colleagues reviewed, only half are available in the Northeast Cover Crop Council region. And these are the 5. It's actually even more limited than that because many of them pretty much target corn soy systems. I think Nutrien had like 1 farm in the Northeast. So there aren't a lot of options out there right now in this region. Most of these market programs are offering $15 to $20 a ton. That probably works out to a few dollars per acre, depending on how they calculate tons of carbon mitigation. Nutrien's payment rate is a bit higher, but again, their footprint in the Northeast is pretty small. I'll just say, if you want to know more, my colleagues have done some really comprehensive looks, not just focused on the Midwest, even though it's hosted at illinoissustainableag.org. But that's a great resource if you're looking for a good overview of where these markets are and what they're doing. So there are a lot of factors driving cover crop adoption. That's why I said we made it. And that's good, because there are also really high expectations for cover crop adoption. So in 2017, there were about 15 million acres. And AFT, we recommended to the Biden administration that they aim to triple the amount of cover crop acres, which we estimate would in total mitigate 14.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. Sounds like a lot. It's only actually 2% of US agricultural emissions, but it is equivalent to removing 3 million cars from the road every year. So a good first step, but in reality, we need to do much, much more with cover crops and with a range of other climate smart practices. The Northeast is off to a good start. You all had among the highest cover cropping rates in the country in 2017. So I want to say well done to all of you in the audience here, because I know that you've been critical in driving this level of adoption in your region. The percentages you see on the screen here are based on total cropland in each state. And that's fine for states that are almost entirely annual crops, but it doesn't really work well in the Northeast because there is a lot of hay and pasture and orchards, as you all know, where annual cover cropping is not really relevant. So I recalculated these as a percent of just annual crops for a handful of states, and the numbers are pretty awesome. In New York, it goes up to 18%, Pennsylvania 23%, and Vermont and Maryland are both at about 40% of eligible annual cropland ground that has a cover crop planted on it, or had a cover crop planted on it in 2017, according to the Census of Agriculture. That's super impressive. There's still a ways to go, but a lot of momentum and a lot of good stuff to build on. Looking nationally, the total acres of cover crops also isn't anything to scoff at. There's more acres of cover crops planted in this country than of spring wheat, of cotton, of sorghum, of fruit and nut trees, of vegetables, and a number of other minor crops. That's impressive. Farmers are planting a lot of cover crops. We know we can do more, we need to do more, but let's give ourselves credit for the good stuff that's happening. And the trend seems to be good. Adoption certainly increased from 2012 to 2017. This chart is showing percentage point increases. And it's not adjusted to be just on annual croplands like I showed before, but it still shows strong growth kind of in the bookends of the Northeast region, with Maine and Vermont in the north and Maryland in the south showing continued high growth rates of cover cropping. The Mid-Atlantic is also doing relatively well, but there's a weaker showing in southern New England. So something to work on. Is this trend going to continue? Can it expand across this region and across the rest of the country? And is it going to give us the level of adoption that we need? I think these are some really critical questions. So if cover crops are surging, let's hope they are. Is this surge going to continue? And it's hard to say. The census data ends in 2017. So we're going to wait for this 2022 census, probably a couple more years before we have that published and have more information. But what it comes down to is whether the people who start adopting cover crops stick with the practice, keep doing it year after year, or if there's kind of a revolving door of new adopters who try it and then maybe give up. So I'm really curious to hear what your experience has been. So I'm going to launch the first poll, and I'm asking for you all, many of you work directly with farmers. Farmers you work with try cover crops, how many of them tend to stick with them for the long term? So we'll just give it a minute or so here to let a bunch of answers come in and see what you all are seeing on the ground. So far it's looking pretty good. Got a lot of 50 to 75. We've got quite a few 75 or more. Just a couple people saying less than 25%, but it's out there. All right, the numbers seem to be stabilizing. It looks like what we're seeing is the majority of you by far are experiencing, over half the farmers that you work with, once they try cover crops, are going to stick with the practice. And quite a few of you think that it's over 75%. I mean, I think that's a really successful rate for adoption of a practice that doesn't always work. I've seen it fail. And there's plenty of ways to screw it up when you're just learning. So that's really impressive to me that cover crops are sticking with, or sorry, farmers are sticking with cover crops to that extent. All right, so I think I need to click end poll. And that's a good sign, but I think it's a question of what does that mean for adoption since 2017. So the 2019 SARE cover crop survey implies that even since the time period that the census covered, a larger percentage of producers are going to be receiving incentives. That would be thanks to EQIP, thanks to the higher payment rate of Conservation Stewardship Program, all these state programs, and now all the carbon market programs. So this should all be driving adoption up. And yet the data that I'm showing here kind of calls that into question. This is from the Optus remote sensing system, and which is managed or created by Regrow, and this data is presented from the Conservation Technology Information Center. The cover crops are, traditional cover crops are in the bottom in the dark green. And the data does show this jump in adoption from 2012 to 2017. But since then, it looks relatively flat. And that suggests that, at least in the Midwest, adoption of cover crops might have stalled. This might be due to low commodity prices. This might be due to weather challenges. It's hard to say. There's just not a lot of good recent data. And so I wanted to throw this up there as kind of the best stuff I could find, even though it's not pertinent to the Northeast. So bringing it back home, for all of you working in the Northeast, working with farmers in the ground, watching what has happened since 2017, what would you say? So here comes poll number 2. I want to know, in the last 5 years, what's happened? Have cover crop adoption levels started to tick down? Is there fatigue? Have they stayed steady? Or are we seeing continued growth, and how much growth are we seeing across the region? As you drive around, as you go to field days, as you talk to farmers, or just with the farmers that you work with, what are you seeing? All right, we got numbers coming in. A few people are seeing it decline, a lot of about the same, but so far, the plurality has it for 25% higher or so. And a few people are thinking that it's growing by even more than that. So I think that's encouraging. Don't like to see that in some places it might be declining or stagnant, but there's enough evidence there that there's some continued growth that I'm hopeful, and I'm glad to see that. But at the same time, I think there's a couple of things that we should think about as far as cover crop adoption in the Northeast. Is the Northeast getting left behind, perhaps, in federal policy and or carbon markets? Like I said, it's not part of the EQIP cover crop initiative. All these crop insurance tools might not be as effective in the Northeast because adoption rates are just lower. It might be necessary to look at dairy programs or other tools that a wider swath of producers are using. And as I said, many carbon markets are not operating in the Northeast. So we need some new tools to tailor it, I think, to this region. Diverse vegetable systems are really important in large parts of the Northeast. So how do we address those folks? And there are a lot of potential approaches to continue to boost adoption in the Northeast. So again, I want to hear your thoughts. This is kind of a poll-a-thon here, right here in the middle of my talk. So I'm going to launch the next one. And I know it's hard to pick just one most effective when all of these things on the screen hopefully have some potential to give us greater cover crop adoption. But which one do you think, if you had to put all your chips on one, which is going to be the most effective? Decreasing the costs of cover cropping, just making it cheaper to get it done. Increasing the profitability for the cash crop. So either you save on fertilizer costs, you save on herbicide costs, maybe you boost the yields. Can we make the cover crop itself harvestable as food, feed, or fuel? Carbon market payments. So far, that is the loser here. Nobody thinks carbon market payments. Oh, we got one vote. What about increasing the financial incentives that we're familiar with from the federal government? And finally, what about government mandates? And we actually do have a few votes there. So as these responses coming in, there's a pretty even distribution. It looks like increasing profitability of the cash crop that follows the cover crop is the winner, along with making the cover crop itself harvestable in some form and financial incentives. So I'm seeing dollar signs here. It seems like the dollar signs associated with cover cropping are what you all think is going to make the biggest difference on whether farmers can adopt them. That makes perfect sense. We know that this has to pencil out at the end of the day. Very interesting though, carbon market payments could be another source of dollars, and we're not seeing a lot of interest. That might reflect what's happening in New England or the Northeast. And we did have 8 votes, 10% of you of the voters thought that government mandates would be the way to go, or at least the most effective, whether they're reasonable or not. And that was in there as an intentionally kind of provocative question, because that would be a departure, let's say, a big one from our traditional approach to voluntary conservation. I am in no way advocating that the government mandates cover crops, but I thought I'd throw it in there and stir the pot. And then it actually made me think that, you know what, in some places, cover crops are kind of mandated, especially in systems that have a lot of manure to deal with or other nutrient management challenges. So I'll ask one last question in this little poll-a-thon and see what you all think. How does that notion strike you? Again, I'm not promoting it. I think it's interesting to talk about, are cover crops maybe already mandated in some form for you all, for the farmers that you work with? If they're not, is it something that we need to do? No, or yeah, maybe, but it's just never going to happen. So why even have the conversation? Very curious to see. All right, there's a few people who are saying that effectively they're mandated due to nutrient management plans. Not a whole lot. That's interesting to me. I didn't really know what the coverage of that approach was on the ground. We've got some people steadfastly saying, yes, we got to do this to get it done. We need these cover crops. But even in a room full of really diehard cover crop advocates, the majority are saying, hey, we're not getting into mandates. And I'm not surprised to see that. I think that's a very realistic and reasonable view, and there's lots of other ways to get cover crops moving forward. But hey, that was fun for me, at least, to hear what you all thought. So with that, that brings me back to what's happening in DC. And I talked about a ton of progress and cool stuff that is going on that's pushing cover crops forward. But there's also controversy. And that is especially related to climate change and agriculture. Not surprisingly, Democrats and Republicans are clashing over climate policy. What is somewhat surprising is that this is bleeding into and becoming a piece of our farm bill debate. And I think there's a chance that cover crops could get caught in the crossfire. I'm concerned that there's, a potential for creating a partisan divide on cover crops, which could just complicate efforts to move these even further into the mainstream. So I'll give you a few examples of what I see going on that could be a cause for concern. The first one is the ill-fated Build Back Better bill. And here's where I'm got the idea that we're kind of treating cover crops as a shovel-ready green infrastructure project. If we can spend the dollars, we can get them out the door, we can get conservation on the ground rapidly. So the proposal here was to put $5 billion into cover crops over 5 years, paying $25 an acre. So if I did the math right, I think that comes out to 40 million acres that could be supported in every year, which is a pretty impressive amount of land that would be covered. Please put it in the chat if I got that math wrong. What's interesting is it's not just about paying the farmers, it's also providing an extra $5 an acre for non-operating landowners. So if you own a farm, you're renting it to someone, they want to plant cover crops and they're getting the $25 an acre, we'll give you $5 just to kind of grease the wheels, make it happen, overcome any hesitancy perhaps on the part of the landowner. It also included a provision to top off prevented planting coverage, make it higher for farmers who are also growing cover crops. So this again is some really good policy innovation. Oops, keep scrolling in the wrong spot. Sorry about that. And I think that's promising, but of course it's also not likely to pass anytime soon. This bill was actually killed by a Democrat, even though it's pushed by Democrats as well, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. But of course, there was not any Republican support for the bill as a whole either. And what we don't know is whether these provisions focused on cover crops and the other ones, the broader provisions for conservation at NRCS, could have passed on their own. It sounds like Manchin would have voted for them, but we don't know about the rest. As for the Republicans, the spending amount alone could make it a no-go, but we never had the vote, so we don't know for sure. I would say that these proposals are laying the groundwork for the 2023 Farm Bill if the Congress is still under Democratic control, which is a big if. Another example is the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And the proposal here is very modest. So all it would do is USDA would publish an official list of greenhouse gas market standards related to providing technical assistance to farmers, verifying greenhouse gas benefits. And entities that want to participate in the markets would just look at the list and self-certify that they're following it. And there'd be an advisory council. So not a super big meaty bill, not a super expensive bill, kind of a light touch way where USDA could help bring some sanity to the carbon markets. And that might be why, the light touch might be why it passed the Senate 92-8. It's extremely bipartisan vote, which is pretty uncommon these days and amazing and a promising sign of the time. But now this bill is stuck in the House and there's a good chance that it won't pass. I think on the Republican side, there's a skepticism about carbon markets, especially if they're being promoted with government spending and programs. But at the same time, liberals are concerned that climate offsets, including from cover crops and agriculture, are just going to let polluters keep polluting elsewhere. So are they really helping the problem or not? Still, given that there was this massive bipartisan vote in the Senate, I think that provides some momentum. I think there's a chance that this will make it over the finish line and become law. And the latest of these, big proposals that are creating some controversy is the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. And this one is happening. It is underway. The dollars are going to go out the door. It was pushed forward by administrative action. A $1 billion program, so a lot less ambitious than what was in Build Back Better, but it uses Commodity Credit Corporation funds to support it. And that has caused some strong concern among Republicans who don't think that that is a valid use of Commodity Credit Corporation funds. What it will do is to provide giant grants up to $100 million. And this has created a feeding frenzy kind of among conservation organizations, among agricultural companies, scrambling to access this funding. And the good thing of that, good side of that, is it's forged new teams with private companies and NGOs and producer groups coming together and trying to figure out how to work together to rapidly scale adoption of climate smart practices like cover crops, and then market the crops that are grown using those practices as climate smart commodities, kind of this whole new class of commodities that was created in a sense to be able to use this Commodity Credit Corporation money, but it could be a gateway to a more market-based approach for supporting climate smart agriculture. And I think cover crops will be at center stage in all of these practices, or many of these projects, I should say, along with no-till, along with nutrient management and some of the other usual suspects. But it does raise a question, what does it take for a commodity to be climate smart? If you plant a cover crop once in a 2 or 3 year rotation, does that make the commodity that you harvest climate smart? The program doesn't really say. It's leaving it up to the applicants to figure that out. And what I hope and believe is that the projects that take a systems approach, that look beyond the silver bullet, will be the ones that rise to the top and get the funding. Again, is this a model for the next Farm Bill? Well, it completely depends on which party is in power. And that brings me to the main event here, the coming 2023 Farm Bill. Farm bills have traditionally been fairly bipartisan, and the divisions have been more regional. So between the Midwest and the South, different crops, different needs. But this is becoming more partisan as the rest of Congress does as well. And infusing climate into this bill, which I believe is essential personally, has the potential to further heighten this partisanship. This time the process is starting in an election year, so you could say that this is going to heighten partisan tension, but that's not really possible. It's already fully heightened. So what it does do is affect the timing and the process. So for instance, the committee leadership might change after the next election, in which case the issues that are discussed this year might be irrelevant by the time the bill actually gets written next year. All right, the million-dollar question: where is Congress headed? What is going to happen as far as control? It looks like the Republicans have a strong chance of taking back the House. You never know, but that's the way things are tending. But there's also a toss-up in the Senate. Could go either way. Regardless, it's going to be very closely divided in that chamber. So Congress as a whole will remain closely divided, most likely. And that, as we know, is often a recipe for gridlock. More of the continuing resolutions that Brandon was mentioning we're operating under right now. So not unlikely to have really big, massive new policies come forward, but you never know. Congress can also surprise us. What's going to happen under these two different scenarios of control? I think if the Democrats hold on, we'll see more ideas like Build Back Better, more on carbon markets, potentially increased spending like was proposed in Build Back Better. But there will still be those two moderate Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, and they most likely will continue to operate as strong checks on the party. So if Republicans take over control, I think it might not be as rosy for cover crops. And I don't think this is because Republicans as a party have an animosity towards cover crops. I don't think that's true at all. But I think there are more headwinds to big policy proposals to push cover crops and fewer drivers. On the headwinds front, the biggest one is just the federal deficit. Spending has skyrocketed during the pandemic. And I would imagine that if Republicans take over Congress, they'll do a new push to rein in spending across the government, which most likely could result in some farm bill cuts like we saw in the 2014 Farm Bill, and those will trickle down to the conservation title. Republicans would also naturally be reluctant to give big policy wins to the Biden administration, so that could be another headwind. On the driver's side, I don't see Republicans aggressively driving cover crops as a climate solution, but there could be other drivers that they are responsive to, including farmer demand and interest. And I can definitely see the Republican Party embracing some of these policy innovations that make it easier to sign up, that have a large bang for their buck, like the $5 an acre crop insurance incentive. So there is still potential to make good progress on cover crops under whatever party is in control or whatever mix of parties. At this point, I want to hear from you again, not in a poll, but if you could just put in the chat, what is your policy wish list? I'll read this later. I'll pull these ideas together and I'll share it with my federal and state policy colleagues at American Farmland Trust. What do you want to see? What do you think would drive cover crop adoption in your area? So as you're pondering that, I'm going to think about this question. How do we avoid the worst effects of the ever-changing political climate? And if you, like me, read too many reports about climate change, you will get that very dry joke in that title, because we're always trying to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But what about the political climate as well? Maybe a simpler way to say this is, how do we maintain bipartisan support for cover crops going forward? And we need both D's and R's to love these CCs. That is going to be important for long-term support. How do we do that? In my opinion, it comes down to the farmers. We need farmers to love cover crops as well and keep demanding support and resources to plant them. So to get that, I think this is probably what all of you do all the time. We need to keep emphasizing the benefits to the farmers for soil health, for yield, for the environment on their farm and in their local community, always bringing it back to the farmer and to the community. And if those farmers keep demanding assistance to grow cover crops, I believe that Congress will continue to respond. But I also think we need to think beyond Congress. It's not just about policy. We need to Congress-proof cover crops to a certain extent. Congressional support is key, but in the long term, it's unreliable. Policy is inherently fickle. And cover crops eventually will need to stand on their own 2 feet. So we need cover crop adoption. We don't just need cover crop adoption. I think we need cover crop addiction. We need farmers to be so committed to cover cropping that they can't give it up. And to get there, we need to develop cover crop systems that are so good, so workable, so profitable for these farmers, so beneficial for their operational resilience, that farmers adopt them as a matter of course and they become the norm. We need cover crops to be at the center of our cropping systems. Basically, we need to make cover crops conventional. They need to be the default for the way that we manage our farms. And you all are the experts at this. I won't belabor it. I think some of the key things we need to focus on are establishment, especially in long season crops, fine-tuning planting green, which is to me a super promising practice if we can make it robust, optimizing mixtures, making mixtures and cover crops as a whole work on all kinds of different operations, including diversified vegetable systems. This picture here is at Spiral Path Farm, a very diversified farm in Pennsylvania that's making them work, but I also understand from colleagues in Massachusetts that there are big challenges to making cover crops work in those systems. So we need more research, we need to maximize benefits, we need to get more legumes into the system. Legumes were by no means the most popular cover crops according to the SARE survey from 2019. So this to me is the direction that's going to help bring cover crops more and more into the center of our cropping systems. There's a lot of different approaches, so I'm going to launch one last poll to find out what you all think are the most critical next steps to make cover cropping easier and more profitable for our farmers. All right, we're seeing a bimodal distribution here. We've got more peer-to-peer learning in the lead and more applied research relevant to farmers, soils, and systems. I'll leave it at that. I couldn't agree more. What else? Well, I think we need to think about growing our covers and eating them too. We need novel systems that generate cash flow. Again, this is a way to insulate cover cropping from the whims of Congress or other policymakers. And we know there are some established options. So forages are important, especially in dairy. In Kentucky, AFT is working with farmers to plant rye to get the cover crop benefits, harvest it for grain, and make bourbon, which is a pretty awesome pretty awesome opportunity in my mind. And there are new crops as well. So camelina and pennycress have the potential to produce a ton of oil and be double cropped with soybean for food oil, for biofuels. Winter pea is increasing in popularity as a food ingredient, and there are lots of options that go beyond this. So when I step back and I think about, we've got a growing population, we have really rapidly surging demand for biofuels, and we have this broad competition for agricultural land, from cities that are sprawling, for nature conservation to protect biodiversity, for climate mitigation. How can we afford not to try to get some food or feed from our covers? I think we're going to have to do it. Maybe not on every acre, but we do need to think big and push the envelope of what we're getting from our cover crop systems. So my last thought is that the case for cover crops really eclipses carbon. It's bigger than that. To secure a long-term role for cover crops in American agriculture, we need holistic systems, a systems approach and a long-term view. And those are not necessarily the things that Congress is particularly good at. But we need to push Congress to keep trying to get cover crop policy and really soil health policy and farm resilience policy right. This Congress did this over decades to make crop insurance the bastion of the system that it is, by continually tweaking it and increasing support. And I think we can ask them to do the same thing for our soil health systems. We also need researchers and farmers to work together to continuously fine-tune cover cropping approaches so that they continue to work even better and become indispensable. I think we need to look beyond our current species and our current systems. We need to see where we can make them even more profitable, productive, and effective as foundational tools that all farmers are using for food production, for conservation, for soil health, as well as for climate resilience and carbon mitigation. So it's a big charge. I know that the people in this room are up to it. I'm excited that there's this many people who are dedicated to the cause just in the Northeast alone. And I want to thank you all for being here today, and I'm excited to have a conversation with all of you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Mitch. That was great. And thanks for providing us an avenue to interact during the conference. The polls were great, and I'm sure, you're speaking. I'm not sure if you can see the chat just lighting up. So people were really engaged. And I would encourage folks, I know you have a lot of comments for Mitch, which are great. We don't really have time to go through all of them. But if you have questions, please, you can type those in the chat if you want. I prefer the Q&A. It's a little easier to keep track of it. There was kind of a question here, I think, from Matt Ryan asking, is it still a cover crop if you're eating them? Then, why not just promote crop rotation and diversity? And Mitch, just so you know, this is a topic that I don't want to say we argue about at the NECCC, but we have a lot of conversation around this.
It's a great question. Hi, Matt, by the way. Good question, thanks. I think we're in a kind of a topsy-turvy world where calling something a cover crop is just sexier than calling it a crop, even if it just basically is a crop. I think it comes back to the way that we think about this, not just we as human beings, not just policymakers who are covering a zillion things. So they might have a little bit of a narrow view of cover crops, but everybody, is juggling a lot. And unless you're one of the 120 people in this room who is in this all the time, it might be hard to see all those complexities. So I think it's just kind of easier for people to say, oh, cover crops are good. We like cover crops are a solution. Oh, cool, we've got these cover crops now that can also be harvested for cash. How awesome is that? Now that's gonna really help push people to plant more cover crops. So it's essentially marketing, right? It's a way of talking about something like, could be just winter rye, winter wheat, or some of the new interesting ones like camelina, pennycress, etc. It's a way of talking about it that quickly gets across the point that we're doing this not just to have a little food or to sell at the end of the day, but we're doing it specifically for the environmental benefits as well. So I think that's how we got into this topsy-turvy world, but it does raise real questions. If a farmer is actually making money on this, what do we need as far as government support? Does it still make sense to take our limited pool of dollars and direct them at some of these for-profit cover crops, so to speak? Maybe if that's going to be a more robust long-term strategy to get adoption, right? There still are challenges. There's still failures that happen early on and a need to learn. And so I think there's still an argument to have some government support for trying out, especially really new cash cover crop systems. But eventually, like I said, I want all of these systems, even if you're not selling it for cash, to stand on their own feet and to have the robustness and profitability, or at least centralness to our farmers' systems, so that they don't need to continually be incentivized by Congress.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a couple. There's a lot of interesting comments in the chat, but one's from Jason Lilly around fuel prices and seed costs and all these increasing costs, and being worried about farmers. If they're gonna use less fuel, will it be the fuel they would have used to put in a cover crop? And so just kind of putting that out there. Any thoughts or comments, I guess, around that?
I think that's definitely a risk. There's a slew pretty much across the board. All of the costs are going up. I think everybody's aware of that. Right now, for large commodities, at least, commodity crops, prices are also up. So for commodity crop producers, it might balance, but if you're a dairy farmer or somebody who buys those commodity crops and it's an input cost, it could be a double or a triple whammy. So I do think there's a risk. I don't think we can expect just a continued upward trend regardless of all these challenges. Farmers will figure it out and do what they think they can make happen, and then hopefully come back to the practice, even if they have to let it go for a little while. But I think more importantly, this is actually a great case for why we do need government support. This is the time when it makes sense to help farmers when they're dealing with just too many costs. They want to do the right thing. They want to plant the cover crop, but they can't take on that financial hardship. Then I think the time is really right for addressing those challenges.
Thank you for that. I just want to remind folks, if you do need pesticide applicator credits, please email Susan so she can work with you on that. And people are asking if they need, to enter the sessions. I think Susan can address that in the chat. Let's see here. I'm just scrolling through. You're going to have a lot of fun reading all this, Mitch. And I'm actually wondering if we should sort of put this back out to the group, because you've created a lot of conversation, people talking about different programs and, what they feel they need. There was a comment here, and something I've been thinking about too, just, money for the technical assistance. So there's a lot of sort of funding that goes to farmers, which absolutely they need it to implement the cover crops. But oftentimes, especially new adopters, they need help. They need TA. They need a little assistance along the way. And that commonly isn't really a focus of funding. We did hear from Brandon today that might be changing, but just anything on the horizon that you've seen that's really going to help up technical assistance to farmers. I mean, extension is always getting cut. Where are we to really help people deploy these practices?
I think that's a major challenge, and AFT is always pushing for more funding for technical assistance to go along with the financial assistance. But I think Congress has shown its stripes again and again that it's much more willing to put dollars on the table that go out the door to farmers. And I don't know if Brandon is still on or would feel comfortable commenting, but Congress is about, or especially if all of these bills had passed, would be asking a huge amount of NRCS. NRCS has been short on staff. I know that the agency has staffed up a lot in the recent year or two. But still, to say, okay, let's just go ahead and double equip. Let's put out $5 billion for cover crops as a new standalone thing. Let's do a $1 billion climate smart partnerships program. All of those are really massive and new. And so I think from headquarters down to the field level staff, there needs to be complementarity between what we're asking as far as putting dollars out to farmers and the support. Because the last thing we need to do is just burn a bunch of cash that's not done in the best way possible, that doesn't lead to the learning and the successful systems that we need. And worst case scenario, farmers say, ah, that didn't work for me, and they walk away. So it's something that I feel really strongly about, but I don't think that there's an easy solution given the reluctance from Congress to put the dollars. Once you hire federal employees, that is a bigger deal than just a one-year annual appropriation. I will say that this Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities program is essentially saying, once the money goes out the door, it's saying, okay, you NGOs, you ag companies, you figure it out. You do the TA, you get the farmers in the door. And that could be very promising. It could leverage the thousands of people who are out there in organizations like AFT, in companies like Land O'Lakes, across the board, or Organic Valley, all the different ones that are going to be looking at projects like this. There's a lot of really knowledgeable people in those companies. They have the ability to hire more flexibly than NRCS. So we might be moving towards a more public-private model of this technical assistance to get cover crops on the ground. I think that's good, but I also think we can't decide that, okay, NRCS staffing levels are not a concern anymore. That's still going to be the fundamental long-term source of that technical assistance that we need.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just, a comment on that. I've been in meetings with various folks about these, large commodity grants, university folks, just saying that they need training. They're not even sure if they could provide the technical assistance that's needed. And so I do think this is a real concern. So I'm sure people will keep pushing to make sure there's plenty of technical assistance for farmers. Whether it'll happen or not, that's a whole nother thing, as you've said. Yeah. Mitch, this has been wonderful. We'll make sure that we get you the chat. And we really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you can stay on and listen to all the presentations.
Yeah, well, thanks again for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun putting this together. I'm seeing all these different comments in the chat, and I can't wait to read it. So yeah, thanks, and good luck on the rest of the conference.